Commander Zethkar adjusted his observation equipment for the third time that morning. The massive alien warrior stood 8 feet tall, his purple-scaled skin gleaming under the artificial lights of his cloaked ship. His 4 eyes moved independently as he scanned the data streams flowing across his control panels. Each screen showed different aspects of the small blue planet below, Earth, the third planet from a yellow star in what the locals called the Sol System. Zethkar had been watching this world for 2 weeks now, preparing for his official assignment. The Valonian Empire had sent him here to study the dominant species and their methods of warfare. It was routine work for someone of his experience. For over 60 years, Zethkar had traveled between star systems, documenting how different species fought their wars. The Empire needed this information to decide which worlds posed threats and which could be easily conquered. His reports had helped the Empire expand across 3 galaxies, adding dozens of new worlds to their territory. The humans of Earth were supposed to be simple. Early scouting reports described them as a young species that had only recently learned to travel between planets. They fought with primitive weapons and showed typical territorial behavior. The Empire expected Zethkar to finish his study within a few months and recommend Earth for easy conquest, but something about these humans already puzzled him. Most species fought wars in predictable patterns. They chose the best locations, used their strongest weapons, and followed basic military logic. Stronger armies attacked weaker ones. Larger forces overwhelmed smaller ones. Resources went too. The most important battles, humans seemed to ignore these rules. Zethkar activated his main viewing screen and focused on a mountainous region called Afghanistan. Below him, 2 human factions engaged in what appeared to be a standard territorial dispute. One group wore matching uniforms and carried similar weapons. The other group dressed in civilian clothes and used whatever weapons they could find. The uniformed soldiers should have won easily. They had better equipment, more training, and superior numbers. Yet the conflict had been going on for years, with no clear victor. This defied every military principle Zethkar understood. He zoomed in on a small outpost where 20 uniformed soldiers had established a defensive position. The building was nothing special, just concrete walls and metal barriers. It held no strategic value that Zethkar could identify. Yet both sides fought desperately to control it. The alien commander activated his recording equipment and began documenting what he saw. His first notes were routine observations about human weapons and tactics. Their firearms were crude compared to Imperial technology, but effective enough for their level of development. Their vehicles were slow and poorly armored, but they used them cleverly in the rough terrain. Then he witnessed something that made him pause his recording. A human soldier named Jake Morrison was checking the perimeter when an explosive device detonated near his position. The blast threw him against a concrete wall and left him trapped under a piece of heavy metal. His leg was clearly broken, and blood pooled beneath him. His radio had been destroyed in the explosion, so he could not call for help, according to standard military doctrine from every species Zethkar had studied. Morrison was now a liability. His injury made him unable to fight or retreat. Helping him would require other soldiers to leave their defensive positions, weakening the entire unit. The logical choice was to abandon him and focus on defending the outpost. Zethkar expected the humans to follow this logic. Instead, he watched Private Lisa Grant crawl out of the safety of the building and begin moving toward Morrison's position. Enemy fighters had already spotted the injured soldier and were advancing to capture or kill him. Grant would have to cross 200 meters of open ground under enemy fire. The alien commander leaned forward in his chair, studying the tactical display. Grant's actions made no sense. She was risking her life and potentially compromising the entire defense for one injured soldier. No rational species would make such a choice. Grant reached Morrison just as the first enemy fighters arrived. She immediately began returning fire while trying to drag the wounded soldier toward safety. When her ammunition ran out, she picked up rocks and threw them at the approaching enemies. When the rocks were gone, she used her bare hands to fight off attackers while continuing to pull Morrison away from danger. 3 other soldiers left their defensive positions to help. Danny Rodriguez, Kevin Walsh, and Amy Patterson formed a protective circle around Morrison and Grant. Each of them took multiple hits rather than retreating to safety. Rodriguez was shot in the shoulder but kept firing. Walsh took shrapnel in his back but continued advancing. Patterson was hit twice in the leg but refused to fall back. Zethkar watched in fascination as the rescue operation unfolded. The humans were displaying behavior that contradicted every military principle he knew. They sacrificed strategic positions to save individuals. They used valuable resources on wounded soldiers rather than advancing their objectives. They chose almost certain death over abandoning their companions. The rescue took 14 hours. Enemy forces attacked repeatedly, trying to overwhelm the small group of defenders. Each time, the humans found new ways to protect their injured comrade. They used pieces of rubble as shields, shared their remaining ammunition, and took turns carrying Morrison when he lost consciousness. By the time medical evacuation arrived, the situation had changed dramatically. Grant had been shot twice and was barely conscious. Patterson had lost so much blood that she could no longer stand. Rodriguez and Walsh both needed immediate medical attention. But Morrison was alive. Zethkar replayed the sequence 17 times, analyzing every detail. In his experience, only pack-bonded species showed such behavior, and only toward genetically related individuals. These humans appeared to exhibit pack bonding toward their entire military unit. Regardless of biological connection, he made detailed notes about this observation, marking it as an anomaly that required further study. Perhaps humans had evolved different social structures than other species. Perhaps their military units functioned as artificial family groups. This would explain their willingness to sacrifice themselves for each other, but as Zethkar continued his observations over the following days, he realized that human behavior was even more complex than he had initially thought. The soldiers did not just protect their own unit members. They showed similar concern for civilians, prisoners, and even enemy wounded who posed no threat. During one incident, a human medic named Dr. Helen Carter treated injured enemy fighters with the same care she gave her own soldiers. She used precious medical supplies on people who had been trying to kill her just hours earlier. When Zethkar analyzed her actions, he found no logical explanation for such behavior. Another incident involved a human patrol that encountered a group of enemy fighters holding civilian hostages. Standard Imperial doctrine would recommend precision strikes to neutralize the threat with acceptable collateral damage. Instead, the humans spent 6 hours negotiating for the release of the hostages, eventually trading their own weapons and supplies for the civilians' freedom. These observations filled multiple data crystals. Zethkar found himself unable to classify human behavior within any known tactical framework. Their actions seemed to be guided by principles that had nothing to do with military effectiveness or survival advantage. Yet somehow, despite these apparent weaknesses, the humans continued to achieve their objectives. They won battles they should have lost, survived situations that should have killed them, and maintained unit cohesion under impossible circumstances. As his first month of observation ended, Zethkar began to suspect that his assignment would not be as routine as he had expected. These humans were unlike any species he had encountered. Their methods of warfare defied logical analysis, yet they seemed to work. The alien commander increased his observation schedule and began preparing for a much longer stay. Whatever secrets these humans possessed, he was determined to understand them. The Empire needed to know what made this species so different from all the others, but deep in his mind, a troubling thought was beginning to form. What if the humans were not just different? What if they were actually superior to the Empire in ways that no one had yet recognized? Zethkar pushed this thought aside and returned to his observations. He had a job to do and he would complete it regardless of what he might discover about these strange, compassionate, and seemingly impossible humans. Commander Zethkar had been observing Earth for 6 weeks when he witnessed something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. The alien warrior was monitoring a supply convoy moving through a dangerous mountain pass when the attack began. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying food, medical supplies, and ammunition to a remote outpost. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison commanded the lead vehicle, scanning the rocky terrain ahead for signs of enemy activity. His team included 6 other soldiers, each alert and ready for trouble. Morrison was an experienced soldier who had served in this region for 2 years. He understood the dangers of the mountain roads and always kept his team prepared for ambush. But the attack came from an unexpected direction, using a new type of explosive device that his sensors could not detect. The blast erupted directly beneath Morrison's vehicle, lifting the heavy armor plating like it weighed nothing. The explosion threw the vehicle off the road and into a rocky crater. Metal twisted and screamed as the armored transport rolled 3 times before coming to rest against a boulder. Zethkar watched from his observation post as the other vehicles immediately took defensive positions. The soldiers inside them began returning fire at enemy positions hidden in the rocks above. This was standard military procedure, exactly what the alien commander expected to see. What he did not expect was what happened next. Private Lisa Grant was in the second vehicle when Morrison's transport was hit. She could see that the lead vehicle had been destroyed and assumed that everyone inside was dead. The logical response would be to continue the mission, evacuate the area, or call for backup. Instead, Grant did something that made no tactical sense. She opened her vehicle's door and began running toward the wreckage. Enemy fighters immediately began shooting at her. Bullets struck the ground around her feet and whizzed past her head. Any rational soldier would have taken cover or returned to safety. Grant kept running. She reached the destroyed vehicle and found Morrison trapped underneath a piece of twisted metal. His left leg was crushed and blood covered his face and uniform. His radio had been destroyed in the blast, so he could not communicate with the other soldiers. He was conscious but clearly in severe pain. Grant immediately began trying to free Morrison from the wreckage. The metal piece was too heavy for her to lift alone, but she kept trying. Enemy fighters were advancing down the mountainside, getting closer with each passing minute. She had no backup, limited ammunition, and no way to call for help. Zethkar analyzed the situation from his ship above. Grant had 2 logical choices. She could abandon Morrison and return to safety, or she could stay and die with him. Either choice would result in the loss of at least 1 soldier. The tactical decision was obvious. Grant chose a third option that defied all military logic. She positioned herself between Morrison and the advancing enemy fighters and began shooting. When her first weapon ran out of ammunition, she picked up Morrison's rifle and continued firing. When that weapon was empty, she found a pistol in the wreckage and used it until no bullets remained. The enemy fighters were now less than 50 meters away. They had automatic weapons in superior numbers. Grant had no ammunition left and no way to defend herself or Morrison. Any logical analysis suggested that both soldiers would be captured or killed within minutes. Instead, Grant began throwing rocks. She picked up stones from the ground around the wreckage and hurled them at the advancing enemy fighters with remarkable accuracy. When she ran out of rocks, she pulled pieces of metal from the destroyed vehicle and threw those as well. The enemy fighters were so surprised by this unexpected response that they actually slowed their advance. 3 other soldiers from the convoy saw what was happening and made their own impossible decision. Danny Rodriguez, Kevin Walsh, and Amy Patterson left their defensive positions and began moving toward the wreckage. Their commanding officer ordered them to stay in position, but they ignored the command. Rodriguez was hit by enemy fire before he reached the wreckage. The bullet struck his shoulder and spun him around, but he kept moving. Walsh took shrapnel in his back from a grenade explosion but continued advancing. Patterson was shot twice in the leg but refused to fall down. The 3 soldiers formed a protective circle around Morrison and Grant. They had limited ammunition and no heavy weapons. Enemy fighters surrounded them on 3 sides, with more reinforcements arriving every few minutes. The situation was tactically hopeless. Zethkar watched as the 4 soldiers began what could only be described as an impossible defense. They shared their remaining ammunition, took turns carrying Morrison when he lost consciousness, and used pieces of the destroyed vehicle as shields. Each of them was wounded, but none of them retreated. The battle lasted 14 hours. Enemy forces attacked repeatedly, trying to overwhelm the small group of defenders. Each assault was repelled by soldiers who should have been defeated in the first few minutes. Rodriguez used his pistol until it was empty, then switched to Grant's rifle. Walsh coordinated their defense while bleeding from multiple wounds. Patterson provided covering fire despite being barely able to stand during the longest enemy assault. Grant ran out of ammunition entirely. She began using her bare hands to fight off attackers who got too close to Morrison. She punched, kicked, and clawed at enemy fighters while they tried to drag her away from the wounded soldier. Her knuckles were bloody and her uniform was torn, but she never stopped fighting. The alien commander had seen combat across dozens of worlds, but he had never witnessed anything like this. The humans were displaying behavior that contradicted every principle of warfare he understood. They sacrificed strategic positions to save individuals. They used valuable resources on wounded soldiers rather than advancing their objectives. They chose almost certain death over abandoning their companions. Most puzzling of all, their impossible tactics seemed to be working. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the 4 soldiers held their position. Enemy fighters began to hesitate before attacking, unsure how to deal with opponents who fought with such desperate determination. As the hours passed, more enemy reinforcements arrived. The situation grew more hopeless with each passing minute. Morrison drifted in and out of consciousness, his condition growing worse without proper medical treatment. Grant's hands were cut and bleeding from handling sharp metal pieces. Rodriguez could barely move his wounded arm. Walsh was leaving a trail of blood wherever he walked. Patterson was so weak from blood loss that she had to lean against the wreckage to stay upright, but none of them gave up. When medical evacuation finally arrived, the scene was unlike anything Zethkar had ever recorded. The 4 soldiers were arranged in a defensive circle around Morrison, each facing outward toward potential threats. They were all wounded, all exhausted, and all should have been dead hours earlier, but Morrison was alive. The rescue helicopters landed under covering fire from other military units. Medical personnel immediately began treating the wounded soldiers. Morrison was loaded onto a stretcher and carried to safety. Grant, Rodriguez, Walsh, and Patterson were all taken to field hospitals for emergency treatment. Zethkar replayed the entire sequence multiple times, analyzing every detail. The humans had achieved something that should have been impossible. They had successfully defended a position against superior forces using nothing but determination and mutual loyalty. Their tactics made no sense from a strategic standpoint, yet they had worked perfectly. The alien commander began documenting his observations, but found himself struggling to explain what he had witnessed. These humans appeared to be guided by principles that had nothing to do with military effectiveness or survival advantage. They seemed to value individual lives above strategic objectives, personal bonds above tactical logic, and moral principles above practical considerations. Yet somehow, these apparent weaknesses had become their greatest strengths. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves for each other had created a fighting force that was far more effective than their equipment or training suggested. They had won a battle that should have been impossible to win. As Zethkar prepared his report for the Valonian Empire, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about warfare. Perhaps military success was not just about superior weapons and tactical advantage. Perhaps there were other factors that his species had never considered. The humans had shown him something new, something that challenged his understanding of how wars were fought and won. They had demonstrated that sometimes the most illogical choice could be the most effective one, but this was only the beginning of what he would learn about these strange, impossible humans. Commander Zethkar had learned to expect the unexpected from humans, but Dr. Helen Carter still managed to surprise him. The alien observer had been monitoring the field hospital for 3 days when he first noticed the human medic doing something that challenged every military principle he understood. The medical facility was located 2 kilometers from the main combat zone, close enough to receive wounded soldiers quickly but far enough away to avoid direct enemy fire. Carter worked 18-hour shifts, treating injuries that ranged from minor cuts to life-threatening wounds. She was skilled, efficient, and dedicated to saving lives. What puzzled Zethkar was that she treated everyone the same way, regardless of which side they fought for. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday morning when enemy fighters brought 3 wounded soldiers to the hospital under a temporary ceasefire agreement. The injured men were unconscious and needed immediate surgery to survive. By all military logic, Carter should have treated them as prisoners or potential threats. Instead, she ordered her medical team to prepare the operating room and began working to save their lives. Nurse Tony Chun assisted Carter as she examined the wounded enemy fighters. The youngest one appeared to be barely 19 years old, with multiple gunshot wounds and severe blood loss. His chances of survival were poor even with immediate treatment. "We should focus on our own people first," Chun suggested quietly. "These beds could be needed for American soldiers." Carter looked up from the wounded boy and shook her head. "He's dying, Tony. We can't let him die when we have the ability to save him." "But he's the enemy," Chun replied. "He was probably shooting at our guys yesterday." "Maybe he was," Carter said while checking the young man's pulse. "But right now he's just a kid who needs help." Zethkar observed this exchange with growing confusion. In his experience, military medical personnel treated their own forces first and enemy wounded only if resources were available afterward. This approach maximized the survival rate of friendly troops while minimizing aid to opposing forces. Carter was doing the opposite. She was using valuable medical supplies, precious time, and limited surgical resources on enemy fighters who would likely return to combat once they recovered. From a strategic standpoint, her actions were helping the enemy while potentially harming her own side, yet she continued working with the same intensity she showed when treating American soldiers. The surgery took 4 hours. Carter removed 3 bullets from the young enemy fighter's chest and abdomen, repaired internal damage, and stabilized his condition. When she finally emerged from the operating room, she was exhausted but satisfied. "He's going to make it," she told Chun. "His vital signs are stable and the bleeding is stopped." Chun nodded but still looked uncomfortable. "What happens when he recovers? Do we just let him go back to fighting our people?" Carter paused at the question. "I don't know. Tony, that's not my job. My job is to save lives, not to decide who deserves to live." Over the following days, Zethkar watched Carter repeat this behavior with other enemy wounded. She treated a fighter who had been caught placing explosive devices, a sniper who had been shooting at American patrols, and a commander who had been coordinating attacks on the base. Each time, she provided the same level of care she gave to American soldiers. She used the same medical supplies, devoted the same attention to their treatment, and showed the same concern for their recovery. When other medical personnel questioned her decisions, she always gave the same response: "They're patients now, not enemies." The alien commander tried to understand the logic behind Carter's actions. Perhaps she was gathering intelligence from the wounded fighters. Perhaps she was trying to improve relations with the local population. Perhaps she was following some complex human military strategy that he had not yet identified. But as he continued observing, Zethkar realized that Carter's behavior was not strategic at all. She was acting according to principles that had nothing to do with military advantage or tactical considerations. She seemed to believe that all wounded people deserved medical treatment, regardless of their political affiliations or military objectives. This belief was tested during the hospital's darkest hour. A massive enemy assault began just before dawn. On a Friday morning, explosions rocked the medical facility as artillery shells landed nearby. The building shook violently, and several windows shattered from the concussive force. All non-essential personnel were ordered to evacuate immediately. Carter was in the middle of emergency surgery when the attack began. Her patient was an enemy fighter who had been brought in an hour earlier with severe abdominal wounds. The young man was unconscious and would die without immediate treatment. "Doctor, we need to evacuate now," Chun said as another explosion shook. The building. The transport helicopters are leaving in 10 minutes. Carter looked up from the operating table where she was working to stop internal bleeding. I can't leave him, Tony. He'll die if I stop now. He's going to die anyway if we all get killed, Chun replied. The whole hospital is being evacuated. We have to go. You go, Carter said, returning her attention to the surgery. I'm staying until this is finished. Chun stared at her in disbelief. You're risking your life for an enemy soldier? He would kill you if he had the chance. Maybe he would, Carter agreed. But right now he's unconscious and dying. He can't hurt anyone, and he needs help. The evacuation alarm continued blaring as Carter worked to save the enemy fighter's life. Explosions grew closer and louder. The building's lights flickered as electrical systems were damaged by the nearby blasts. Medical equipment shook on its stands as each detonation sent vibrations through the floor. Chun made his own impossible decision. Instead of evacuating to safety, he remained in the operating room to assist Carter. Together, they continued the surgery while the battle raged. Around them, Zethkar watched this scene with amazement. 2 humans were risking their lives to save someone who belonged to a military force that was actively trying to kill them. They were using precious medical resources on an enemy soldier while their own facility was under attack. They were making choices that defied every principle of military survival and strategic thinking. The surgery took 2 hours to complete. During that time, the building was hit by shrapnel from 3 different explosions. The operating room's windows were blown out, and pieces of the ceiling fell onto the floor. But Carter and Chen never stopped working. As they sutured the final incision, the enemy fighter began to regain consciousness. He opened his eyes and looked around the room with confusion. When he saw Carter and Chun, he tried to speak but was too weak to form words. Carter leaned down and spoke softly to him in his native language. She had learned some basic phrases during her time at the hospital, enough to communicate simple medical information. You're safe, she told him. The surgery was successful. You're going to recover. The young man's eyes filled with tears. He whispered something that Zethkar's translation system identified as thank you in the local language. Carter smiled and patted his shoulder gently. Rest now, you need to heal. When evacuation teams finally arrived, they found Carter and Xian still in the operating room with their patient. The enemy fighter was stable and conscious, though still very weak. The medical team had successfully saved his life despite the chaos and danger surrounding them. The evacuation team leader looked at Carter with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Doctor, you could have been killed. Why didn't you evacuate? With the others? Carter glanced at the enemy fighter, who was now sleeping peacefully. Because he needed help, and I was the only one who could provide it. But he's the enemy, the team leader said. He was probably fighting against us yesterday. I know, Carter replied. But today he was just a patient who needed surgery. That's all that mattered. As the wounded enemy fighter was loaded onto a medical transport, he looked back at Carter. One final time. Their eyes met for a moment, and he mouthed the words, "Thank you," again. Carter nodded and smiled. Zethkar recorded every detail of this incident, but found himself struggling to categorize Carter's behavior. She had risked her life and valuable resources to save someone who posed a potential threat to her own military forces. She had shown compassion to an enemy when logic dictated hostility or indifference. Most puzzling of all, her actions seemed to have created something unexpected. The enemy fighter she had saved was now looking at American soldiers with confusion, rather than hatred. He had experienced kindness from people he had been taught to see as enemies. Perhaps there was more to human military strategy than Zethkar had initially understood. Commander Zethkar had been observing human warfare for 3 months when Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb faced the decision that would challenge everything the alien warrior thought he knew about military strategy. The situation began with an intelligence report that arrived at Webb's forward operating base on a quiet Thursday morning. The report was clear and urgent. Enemy forces were planning a major attack on a small village called Calabad, located 15 kilometers from Webb's position. The attack would begin at dawn the following day and would likely result in significant civilian casualties. Webb studied the intelligence data carefully. Calabad was home to approximately 300 people, mostly elderly residents and children whose families had been unable to evacuate during previous conflicts. The village held no strategic military value. It contained no weapons manufacturing facilities, no important roads or bridges, and no military installations. From a purely tactical standpoint, Calabad was irrelevant to the current conflict. Defending it would require Webb to divide his forces and potentially compromise his main mission of protecting a crucial supply route that kept 3 other military bases operational. Webb called his senior officers together for a strategic planning meeting. The situation was presented clearly to Captain Rachel Stone, Major John Hayes, and Lieutenant Sam Cooper. The intelligence indicated that enemy forces planned to use the village attack as a distraction while launching a secondary assault on the supply route. The logical choice is obvious, Major Hayes said after reviewing the data. We maintain our position here and defend the supply route. If we divide our forces, we risk losing both objectives, Lieutenant Cooper agreed. The supply route supports 3 bases and over 800 soldiers. We can't risk their safety for a village that has no military significance. Captain Stone remained quiet during the discussion, but Webb could see that she was troubled by the decision. Finally, she spoke up. What about the civilians? 300 people are going to die if we do nothing. Hayes shook his head. That's unfortunate, but we have to consider the greater good. Our primary mission is to maintain the supply route. If we fail in that mission, many more people could die. Webb understood the logic of Hayes' argument. Every military academy in the galaxy taught the same principle. Resources should be allocated to achieve maximum strategic advantage. Emotional considerations should not override tactical necessity. The needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few, but as Webb looked at the intelligence report again, he found himself thinking about the 300 civilians who would die if he followed standard military doctrine. Most of them were children and elderly people who had no involvement in the conflict. They were simply unfortunate enough to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sir, Major Hayes prompted, what are your orders? Webb was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Then he made a decision that defied every principle of military strategy he had been taught. We're going to defend both positions, he announced. Captain Stone, you'll take 23 soldiers and move to Calabad immediately. Establish defensive positions and prepare for the attack. Major Hayes, you'll remain here with the remaining forces to defend the supply route. The room fell. Silent, Lieutenant Cooper was the first to speak. Sir, with respect, dividing our forces leaves both positions vulnerable. We don't have enough personnel to adequately defend both locations. I understand the risks, Webb replied, but I'm not willing to let 300 civilians die when we have the ability to save them. Sir, Hayes said carefully, our primary mission is to protect the supply route. If we fail in that mission, we'll be court-martialed. Webb nodded. I'll take full responsibility for the decision. If headquarters wants to blame someone, they can blame me. Captain Stone had been listening to the discussion with growing respect for her commanding officer. Sir, what if we can't hold both positions? What if the enemy overwhelms us? Then we'll have tried, Webb said simply. I'd rather fail while trying to save lives than succeed while letting innocent people die. Zethkar observed this conversation from his monitoring station, analyzing every word and gesture. Webb's decision violated every tactical principle the alien commander understood. Dividing forces in the face of superior enemy numbers was considered one of the most basic military mistakes. Yet Webb had chosen to make this mistake deliberately. Fully aware of the consequences, the alien warrior tried to understand the logic behind Webb's choice. Perhaps the humans had some strategic advantage he had not identified. Perhaps they had reinforcements arriving that would change the tactical situation. Perhaps they had intelligence about enemy weaknesses that made the mission feasible, but as Zethkar continued monitoring the situation, he realized that Webb had no hidden advantages. The human commander was simply choosing to risk military failure rather than allow civilian casualties. He was prioritizing the lives of non-combatants over strategic objectives. Captain Stone led her team to Calabad that evening, arriving just as the sun was setting. The village was eerily quiet, with most residents hiding in their homes. Stone immediately began assessing the defensive possibilities, looking for ways to protect 300 civilians with only 23 soldiers. The tactical situation was nearly hopeless. The village offered little natural cover, and the buildings were made of lightweight materials that would not stop bullets. Enemy forces would have superior numbers, better equipment, and the advantage of choosing when and where to attack. Stone gathered her soldiers in the village center and explained the situation honestly. "We're outnumbered about 10 to 1, she said. "We don't have heavy weapons, and we can't call for reinforcements. Our job is to protect these people until help arrives." Sergeant Ashley Ford raised her hand. "Captain, what if help doesn't arrive? What if we can't hold our position?" Stone looked at the houses around them, knowing that each one contained families who were counting on her team for protection. "Then we make sure every civilian gets out safely, even if we don't." The attack began at dawn, just as the intelligence report had predicted. Enemy forces approached the village from 3 different directions, using the early morning darkness to get close to the defensive positions. Stone soldiers were spread thin around the perimeter, each one responsible for protecting a sector much larger than standard. Doctrine recommended. The first wave of attackers hit the eastern side of the village. Corporal Ben Hayes and Private Maria Santos held that position with only 2 rifles and limited ammunition. They should have been overwhelmed within minutes, but they used every piece of cover available, moving constantly to avoid being pinned down. When Hayes was hit by enemy fire, Santos dragged him to safety while continuing to shoot at the advancing fighters. When her rifle jammed, she used Hayes' weapon while he applied pressure to his own wounds. Together, they held their position for over an hour on the western side. Sergeant Ford coordinated the defense while bleeding from shrapnel wounds that should have incapacitated her. She moved from position to position, encouraging her soldiers and redistributing ammunition as needed. When Private Tim Walker was knocked unconscious by an explosion, Ford carried him to safety while maintaining covering fire. The battle raged for 6 hours. Enemy forces attacked repeatedly, probing for weaknesses in the defensive line. Each assault was repelled by soldiers who exceeded their physical capabilities through sheer determination. Individual humans performed acts that should have been impossible. Driven by their commitment to protecting the civilians behind them, Stone herself was shot twice during the fighting, but she refused medical attention until the battle was over. She coordinated the defense while sitting behind a concrete barrier, blood soaking through her uniform. When enemy fighters got close to the village center, she picked up a rifle and joined the fighting despite her injuries. The most critical moment came when enemy forces broke through the southern defensive line. A group of fighters reached the village center where most of the civilians were hiding. Stone and 3 other soldiers found themselves surrounded, with no cover and no escape route. Instead of surrendering or retreating, they formed a protective circle around the building where the civilians were sheltering. They used their bodies as shields, accepting enemy fire while preventing any fighters from reaching the non-combatants. Private Kevin Murphy was killed during this final stand, shot while protecting a group of children. Private Lisa Chun was wounded so severely that she lost consciousness, but she continued fighting until she collapsed. Stone herself was hit again, this time in the leg, but she kept shooting until her ammunition was exhausted. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found a scene that defied military logic. 23 soldiers had successfully defended 300 civilians against a force of over 200 enemy fighters. 17 of the defenders were wounded and 1 was dead. But every single civilian had survived. Webb's gamble had succeeded, but at a tremendous cost. The supply route had also been defended successfully, but with much greater difficulty than if the forces had not been divided. Several vehicles had been destroyed, and the road was temporarily blocked. Zethkar analyzed the entire operation from his observation post, trying to understand how the humans. Commander Zethkar had been observing Earth for 6 months when he witnessed the final incident that would forever change his understanding of human warfare. The alien warrior was preparing his departure from the planet, reviewing hundreds of hours of recorded data, when a human patrol encountered a situation that challenged every assumption he had made about military conflict. The patrol consisted of 8 soldiers led by Sergeant Mike Thompson, a veteran with 15 years of military service. They were conducting a routine reconnaissance mission in a valley known for enemy activity when they received an urgent radio transmission from a nearby village. "American Patrol, this is Village Elder speaking," the voice said in broken English. "Enemy fighters here, they have children. Please help us." Thompson immediately changed course toward the village, even though his orders were to avoid civilian areas during reconnaissance missions. When his team reached the outskirts of the settlement, they found a situation that defied standard military response protocols. 6 enemy fighters had taken position in the village school, holding 12 children hostage. The fighters were armed with automatic weapons and explosives, making any direct assault extremely dangerous. The children ranged in age from 6 to 14 years old, all too young to understand the political reasons behind the conflict. Thompson assessed the tactical situation quickly. Standard Imperial doctrine would recommend precision strikes to neutralize the threat with acceptable collateral damage. The loss of some civilian lives would be regrettable but necessary to eliminate the enemy fighters and prevent future attacks, but Thompson did not follow standard doctrine. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to establish a perimeter around the school and began trying to communicate with the enemy fighters. He used a loudspeaker to call out to them in their native language, offering to negotiate for the release of the children. Zethkar watched from his observation post as Thompson's team took positions that prioritized the safety of the hostages over their own tactical advantage. They could have surrounded the building and forced a confrontation, but instead they maintained distance to avoid provoking the enemy fighters. "This is Sergeant Thompson of the United States Army," he announced through the loudspeaker. "We want to talk. Nobody needs to get hurt today." The enemy fighters responded by threatening to kill the hostages if the soldiers did not withdraw. Thompson's team had superior weapons and better training, but the presence of the children made their advantages meaningless. Any aggressive action could result in civilian casualties. Thompson made a decision that shocked the alien observer. He removed his weapons, raised his hands above his head, and began walking toward the school building alone. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" Private Carl Baker called out. "They could kill you." "Maybe," Thompson replied without stopping. "But they might also listen to me." Zethkar analyzed Thompson's actions with growing confusion. The human soldier was walking into a situation where he had no tactical advantage, no backup plan, and no guarantee of survival. He was making himself completely vulnerable to enemy fighters who had already demonstrated hostile intent. Thompson reached the school entrance and sat down on the ground, placing his hands on his knees where the enemy fighters could see them. He began speaking in a calm, steady voice, using simple words that the fighters could understand. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I'm here to talk. I have something to show you." Slowly, Thompson reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small collection of photographs. He held them up so the enemy fighters could see them through the windows. "These are pictures of my family," he said. "My wife, Emma, my daughter, Sophie, my son, Luke. Sophie is 8 years old, about the same age as some of the children you're holding." The enemy fighters did not respond immediately, but Zethkar noticed that they were listening carefully to Thompson's words. The alien commander activated his advanced sensors to monitor the situation more closely. Thompson continued talking, describing each photograph in detail. He spoke about his daughter's favorite toys, his son's interest in sports, his wife's work as a teacher. He made his family seem real and human, not abstract concepts in a distant war. "I know you have families too," Thompson said. "You have children who depend on you, people who love you and want you to come home safely. I understand that." After several minutes of this one-sided conversation, one of the enemy fighters appeared at the window. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with the nervous expression of someone who was not entirely comfortable with the situation. Thompson noticed the fighter's appearance and began speaking directly to him. "You look like you're about the same age as my younger brother," he said. "He's 23 and just finished college. What do you want to be when this war is over?" The young fighter stared at Thompson for a long moment, clearly surprised by the question. Finally, he called out in broken English, "I want to be teacher, like my father." Thompson smiled and nodded. "Teaching is a good profession. My wife is a teacher too. She says it's the most important job in the world because you get to help children learn and grow." The conversation continued for over an hour. Thompson spoke about his hopes for the future, his desire to see his children grow up in a peaceful world, and his belief that most people wanted the same things, regardless of which side they fought. For gradually, other enemy fighters began joining the conversation. They spoke about their own families, their dreams for the future, and their weariness with the ongoing conflict. Thompson listened to each story with genuine interest, treating former enemies as fellow human beings. The breakthrough came when the youngest enemy fighter, who could not have been more than 18 years old, began to cry. He spoke rapidly, in his native language, and Thompson's translator identified the words as a desperate plea to go home to his mother. Thompson stood up slowly and walked closer to the window. "I have a son about your age," he said gently. "When he was scared as a little boy, I used to tell him that everything would be okay. I'm telling you the same thing now. Everything is going to be okay." The young fighter looked at Thompson with confusion and hope. "You promise?" he asked in English. "I promise," Thompson replied, "but you need to let the children go first. They're scared too, and they want to go home to their families just like you do." What happened next defied every principle of military strategy that Zethkar had ever learned. The enemy fighters began discussing the situation among themselves, and within minutes they had made a decision that no tactical analysis could have predicted. They released the hostages. One by one, the 12 children walked out of the school building and ran toward Thompson's position. None of them had been harmed during their captivity. The enemy fighters watched from the windows as the children were reunited with their families, who had been waiting anxiously at the edge of the village. But the most remarkable part of the incident was still to come. After releasing the hostages, the enemy fighters also surrendered their weapons and came out of the building with their hands raised. They had chosen to end their participation in the conflict rather than continue fighting. Thompson's team took the former enemy fighters into custody, but they treated them with respect and dignity. They provided medical attention for minor injuries, shared food and water, and arranged for them to contact their families to let them know they were safe. As situation concluded, Zethkar realized that he had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic warfare. Thompson had resolved a hostage situation without firing a single shot, using nothing but communication and empathy. He had turned enemies into allies through simple human connection. The alien commander began preparing his final report for the Valonian Empire, but found himself struggling to explain what he had observed. How could he describe a species that treated warfare as a last resort rather than a first option? How could he explain soldiers who saw enemies as fellow beings rather than threats to be eliminated? Zethkar reviewed all of his recorded data from the past 6 months. He had documented hundreds of incidents where humans had chosen compassion over tactical advantage, mercy over military efficiency, and individual lives over strategic objectives. In every case, these apparently irrational choices had somehow led to positive outcomes. The humans had shown him that warfare was not just about superior weapons and tactical advantage. It was about the principles that guided military action, the values that determined how conflicts were fought, and the humanity that soldiers maintained even in the most difficult situations. As Zethkar prepared to depart Earth, he transmitted his final report to the Valonian Empire. His recommendation was simple but revolutionary. Humanity should be classified as a non-hostile species of extreme strategic importance. Their military capabilities exceed their technological limitations through psychological factors that require further study. No imperial contact should be attempted without extensive preparation and peaceful intent. He deleted the final paragraph he had written but chose not to transmit. These humans have shown me that there are alternatives to conquest and domination. They fight wars as if every life matters, treating enemies as fellow beings rather than obstacles to be eliminated. They have weaponized their own compassion, turning mercy into strength and empathy into tactical